The Jaguar rose 10 paces from Dale Sutton and made a sound that was not a growl and not a warning, and his hand shook so hard the latch rattled under his fingers. Something small scratched at the barn door behind her, weak and desperate. He understood then. Whatever he had sealed inside 3 days ago was still alive, and this animal had not come for the cattle at all. Before we go on, drop a comment telling me what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Dale had watched it all begin from his kitchen window less than an hour before. Coffee going cold in a chipped mug his late wife had picked out of a bin at the Sonoita hardware store more than 20 years back. The sun had barely split the horizon over his cattle operation, painting the mesquite scrub in that soft rose color he still could not name, when a shape moved along the tree line at the eastern fence. He almost didn't look twice. Coyotes came through most mornings, sometimes a mule deer, once in a great while a black bear coming down from the Santa Ritas. He blinked, though, and set the coffee down, because the shape did not move like anything he had seen before on his land in the 31 years he had run cattle here. It moved with a low, gliding certainty, and even from 300 yards, Dale could tell it was cat-shaped, and it was big. He stepped closer to the window and squinted through the glass, and his stomach dropped clean through the floorboards. A jaguar. A full-grown female, spotted flanks catching the early light, walking his fence line at a steady, unhurried pace, like she owned every inch of ground she touched. Dale set his mug down without looking at the counter and felt behind him for the rack where his hat hung. He never took his eyes off her. She was maybe 120 pounds by the look of her, lean and long, and her tail swung once against the barbed wire and made no sound at all. Dale had lived in southern Arizona his whole life. He had heard the stories, of course. Old ranchers up in the Chiricahuas swore they had seen jaguars back in the 50s, and once every few years, the biologists put out a photo of some tomcat that had wandered across from Sonora and been caught by a trail camera up in the Huachucas. But those were males, always males, and they were ghosts, seen once and never again. There had not been a breeding female jaguar in the United States in most of Dale's lifetime. Everyone knew that. And yet here she was, 40 yards from his kitchen window, walking his fence like she had come home. He stepped onto the porch and expected everything to go sideways. He waited for the cattle to break. He waited for the horses in the near paddock to scream. He waited, most of all, for the jaguar to spring, because his Herefords were grazing not 20 yards from her line of travel, and any predator with a working stomach would have seen 100 fat calves and made a straight run at the youngest. She never even turned her head. She walked past them like they were painted on canvas. The cattle shifted, bumped together, lowed softly the way cattle do when something spooks them without them quite knowing why, and the jaguar did not so much as flick an ear. Dale watched her pass the herd and keep going. She was not hunting. She was not passing through. She was going somewhere. She had a destination in her head as certain as any postman on a route, and Dale's blood went cold in his fingertips when he saw where she was headed. The old equipment barn sat at the far southeast corner of the property, half hidden behind a stand of grey oak Dale's father had planted the year Dale was born. It was not much of a barn anymore, honestly. It had held the tractor and the swather back when the Sutton place ran hay along with cattle, but the tractor had died a slow death 6 summers ago, and Dale had never got around to replacing it. The barn now held a few coils of old fence wire, a broken hay elevator, and a stack of feed sacks he had been meaning to move. It had not been opened in 3 days. He knew that for certain, because Dale had latched the door himself on Tuesday evening, and he had a specific reason for having done so. The jaguar reached the barn and stopped. She did not circle. She did not test the air. She lowered her head and pressed her muzzle to the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the packed dirt sill, and then she sat down. That was the thing that scared Dale worse than anything he had felt in a long time. Not the size of her, not the teeth he knew were tucked behind that black lip, not the fact that she was standing on his property in violation of every natural law he thought he understood. It was the stillness. She sat down at that door like she had a right to be there. She sat with a focused, aching patience he had never seen in any wild animal, and the sound she made from deep in her chest was a low, hollow rumble that did not sound like hunting and did not sound like threat. It sounded like waiting. Dale went back inside and picked up the phone and called Pam Lorenas, because Pam had more sense than anyone he knew, and she lived closer than the sheriff. Pam had run the little clinic in town for almost 40 years before she retired to help her son with his outfitting business. She had grown up on a working ranch in the Pelonchillos and had once, when she was a very young woman, tracked a mountain lion through 6 inches of fresh snow just to see where it went. If anyone in the county would understand what he was looking at, it was Pam. She listened to him without interrupting for the first minute. Then she said she was on her way and hung up the phone. She was there in 9 minutes, driving her old white pickup up the gravel drive with more speed than the road really allowed. She parked without cutting the engine and stepped out, and Dale handed her his binoculars without saying a word. Pam raised them to her eyes. She stood there a long time. Dale could hear the wind moving in the tops of the cottonwoods along the wash. He could hear a mourning dove somewhere off toward the tank. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, thick and uneven, and he could not remember the last time his own body had felt so loud. Pam lowered the binoculars slowly and set them on the hood of the truck. She turned to Dale, and her face was doing something he had not seen on it in the 20 years they had been neighbors. She looked as if she were solving a puzzle she did not want to have to solve. She told him, very quietly, to listen. Dale listened, and then he heard it, and everything inside him fell. It was the thinnest sound, barely a sound at all, more breath than noise, a little whimper, broken, small. He looked at Pam. Pam looked back at him, and did not say a single word, because she did not need to. Dale understood. 3 days ago, on Tuesday, right before the sun went down, Dale had gone out to the equipment barn to check on something he was almost sure had been living inside it. For the better part of a week, he had been finding fresh scat along the northern wall and small tracks in the dust by the door. And one evening at dusk, he had seen what he thought was a bobcat slip out of the shadow of the barn and vanish into the mesquite. Bobcats did not usually make trouble for cattle, but Dale had lost 2 barn cats to something over the spring, and he had decided he did not want a bobcat setting up house in his equipment barn either. He had walked out that Tuesday with a flashlight and a bag of loud gravel he meant to shake in the corners, and he had gone into the barn and swung the beam around every corner, up in the loft, behind the sacks, along the wall where the fence coils were stacked. He had seen nothing. He had believed honestly and completely that whatever had been in there had gone, and so he had come out and pulled the door shut and slid the latch home and gone back to the house to eat his supper. Whatever had been in that barn had been in there since Tuesday evening. 3 full days, 3 full nights. In July, heat that had cracked 107 degrees on Thursday afternoon, with no water, with no way out, with the mother of it walking somewhere on the other side of the door, unable to reach it, and Dale ate his supper and went to bed and got up and worked cattle and never once heard a thing. He crossed the yard slowly, and his knees felt like water. Pam stayed by the truck, both hands flat on the hood as if to keep herself in place. The Jaguar had not moved. She was watching Dale come. She was watching him with a stillness so complete it was almost worse than being watched by a person, because a person's eyes told you what they wanted from you, and hers told you nothing at all except that she was seeing you exactly, from your boot heels to the sweat on your temples, and she was waiting to see what you would do. Dale did the things he had learned to do around big animals when he was young. He kept his eyes off her face. He kept his shoulders soft and his hands open. He moved slowly, not creeping, just calm, the way you walk toward a horse that has been hurt. At 15 feet from the door, she rose to her feet. He stopped. She did not step toward him. She did not lay her ears back. She lowered her head and let out that low, questioning sound from her chest again, and then she stepped one long stride to the side, just one, and the gap between her and the door widened by the exact amount he needed to reach the latch. She had moved for him. That was the thing Dale would carry for the rest of his life. A 120-pound wild Jaguar had stepped aside to let him come to the door. He put his hand on the latch. He could hear the whimper more clearly now. It was the sound of something at the very end of what it could stand. His fingers closed on the metal, and the latch was hot from the morning sun already, and he slid it free, and he pulled the door open, with his heart hammering so hard against his ribs he thought the animal could probably hear it. Something small stumbled into the light. At first, Dale could not make sense of what he was seeing. It was smaller than a house cat, and yet it moved with a body plan that was not house cat and not bobcat, and not anything he had ever laid eyes on before. Spotted, round-headed, legs slightly too long for its body, blinking hard against the brightness, blinking with those blue, cloudy baby eyes that had not fully turned yet. 8 weeks old, maybe a little more. It swayed and took a small, uncertain step, and its ribs pushed out through the loose skin along its sides like the ribs of a bird. A jaguar cub. The mother was on it in 2 long strides. She lowered her enormous spotted head and pressed her nose to the cub from the top of its ears to the base of its tail. She read the cub the way a person might read a book they had been away from for too long, 1 page at a time, and the cub pushed its whole small body up into her chest and made a sound that was somewhere between a mew and a sob. The mother made her low rumble again, and this time the rumble had a different color to it, a kind of shaking under it, and Dale understood he was standing in a place he did not belong, and he took 1 careful step backward, then another. He kept backing away until he had put 20 feet between him and them. Then he stopped and simply watched. The cub tried to nurse and could not manage it standing, so it lay down on its side in the dirt at the sill of the barn door. And the mother lay down beside it, curling her body around it, the way any mother of any species would do. The cub did not nurse long. It was too weak. But it pushed its face into the fur of her chest, and it closed those blue, cloudy eyes, and it made a small, high sound that Dale did not have a word for. He heard Pam behind him, walking up slowly. He did not turn. He did not want to move. He was afraid if he so much as breathed too loud, he would break the thing he was looking at. The 2 jaguars stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe a little longer. Dale never knew. Time had gone strange in his head. Then the mother rose, and the cub tried to rise with her and could not manage it, and the mother lowered her head and picked the cub up in her mouth by the loose skin behind its neck, the way a domestic cat carries a kitten, and she walked. She walked past Dale at a distance of maybe 18 feet, and she did not look at him, not once, and she carried her cub down along the fence line toward the wash. And then she stepped down into the wash, and she was gone. Dale stood at the open barn door for a very long time. He walked inside eventually. The floor was hard-packed dirt, scarred with the small, circling paw prints of an animal that had paced and paced and paced for 3 days, looking for a way out. The empty feed pails had been knocked over and dragged. There was a smear on one of the walls where the cub had tried again and again to climb something taller than itself and had slid back down. Along the base of the far wall, where the pups of anything trapped go to hide from the world, there was a small hollow scooped out of the dirt. And in that hollow there was the shape of a body that had lain there and given up. Dale had put an animal in a place like that, not on purpose. He had not known, but he had. He had slid that latch on Tuesday evening and gone home to his supper, and he had let a baby lie in that dirt for 3 days without water. Outside, there was an old aluminum water trough beside the barn that he had not filled in years. He walked around and looked at it, and it was bone dry, cracked in one corner. The dirt around it was printed with small paw prints pressed deep, walked over and over, hopeful and then not. He turned on the hose that ran from the well, and he filled the trough anyway. He filled it all the way to the top. He could not have said why. There was no cub anymore to drink from it, but he filled it. Pam came and stood beside him. She rested her hand on his forearm and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. The sun was barely up, and Dale Sutton felt something rearrange itself inside his chest that would not go back the way it had been before. He slept badly that night. He did not sleep at all, in truth. He lay on his side with the window open, listening to the sounds of his own place, and every rustle in the mesquite outside his bedroom made him sit up. He kept expecting to hear that low rumbling sound again. He kept expecting to hear it and not to know whether it was coming from outside his house or from inside his own head. Around 3 in the morning he got up and put on his boots and walked out to the equipment barn with a flashlight. He did not go inside. He stood at the door and looked at the trough. The water was still full. There were no paw prints in the fresh dust. He went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and thought about calling somebody. He was not sure who. The sheriff would come and take notes and shrug. Game and fish, maybe. But he thought about the newspapers picking it up, and he thought about the biologists coming out with their cameras and their coats, and he thought about what would happen to a Jaguar mother and her cub if the whole world knew where they were. And he did not pick up the phone. He picked it up in the morning, though, and he called Pam. Pam came over at 9 with a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of pan dulce from the bakery on the highway. She sat down at his kitchen table and slid the bag across to him. She said what he had already been thinking. She said there had not been a breeding Jaguar in the United States in his lifetime, and probably not in his father's either. She said if the news of this got out the wrong way, it would bring people onto his land, whether he wanted them or not. She said there were biologists at the university in Tucson who would know the right way to handle it. And there were also, she said carefully, people in the ranching community who would not want that Jaguar on their pasture no matter what she did or did not eat, and those people would not wait for a biologist. Dale rubbed his hand across his face. He knew who she meant. Everybody in Sonoita and Elgin knew who she meant. Buck Hollister ran the biggest cattle outfit south of Interstate 10, spread across nearly 12,000 acres of leased and deeded land, and Buck had a saying about predators he liked to repeat at any gathering with more than 3 people in it. He said the only good cat was a nailed-up cat. He had hunted mountain lions with dogs for decades before it got fashionable to complain about it, and he had shot a bear once that had crossed onto his ground and left it out for 3 days on the county road as a message to any other bear that might be thinking about it. Buck was not a bad man exactly. He was a man from another century who had run out of century, and he did not intend to give any ground to anything that walked on 4 legs and had teeth. Dale told Pam he did not know what to do. Pam told him to do the next thing in front of him, and the next thing in front of him was to keep the barn latched shut so no other little thing wandered into it, and to keep his mouth shut in town, and to fill the trough again. Pam finished her coffee and left. Dale filled the trough. The Jaguar came back that afternoon. He was mending fence on the far side of the pasture when he saw her, or thought he saw her, up on the low ridge to the east where the mesquite gave way to yucca. She was watching him. He straightened up slowly and put down the wire stretcher. She was too far to see clearly, but he knew the shape. He would know that shape now for the rest of his days. He stood very still, and she stood very still, and after a minute or two, she turned and slid down the far side of the ridge, and was gone. He walked back to the house at a pace that felt strange, because it was not quite running and not quite walking. He got out the binoculars. He went to the equipment barn. The trough was down about 6 inches. He filled it back to the top. She came the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. She never approached the house. She never came within 50 yards of the cattle. She would appear along the tree line at odd hours, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk, once at high noon, and she would stand or sit and watch Dale from a distance, and then she would go. Dale started to notice a pattern. She came from the same direction every time, down the wash from the southeast, which meant she was denning somewhere in that country, which meant the cub had made it wherever she was taking him. That thought loosened a knot in Dale's chest he had not realized was there. On the 6th day, she came right down into his yard and drank from the trough. He was standing at the kitchen window when she did it. She walked across his back 40 as calmly as if she were a barn cat coming in for supper. She stopped at the trough. She lowered her head. Her tongue moved and moved and moved. She drank for what felt like a very long time. She raised her head, and water ran down her chin, and she turned her face toward the kitchen window, and Dale swore later, though he never said it to anyone but Pam, that she looked directly at him, right into the glass. Right through the glass. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds, then she turned and walked away and disappeared into the wash. Dale sat down on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet. He did not know why. His legs simply would not hold him. He sat there for a while, and he thought about his wife, dead now 9 years, and he thought about the daughter she had wanted and never got. And he thought about the empty half of his kitchen table and the way it had been empty for so long he had stopped noticing it. He did not cry exactly, but his face was wet when he stood back up. The mistake, when it came, was not his. That is the thing he told himself later and had to keep telling himself. But it was a mistake made by someone he trusted, and trust is a kind of choice, and so a part of him would carry it anyway. Marcus was Dale's hired hand, and had been for the better part of 4 years. Marcus was 29 years old and quiet and a hard worker, and he had come up from Douglas after some kind of trouble Dale never fully asked about, because Marcus paid rent on the little casita out back and never gave Dale one moment of grief. Marcus was there the afternoon Buck Hollister's truck pulled up the drive, and Marcus was standing at Dale's shoulder when Buck got out and set his hat on the hood of the truck and did the thing Buck always did, which was smile with his mouth and not his eyes. Buck said he had heard something. Dale asked him what he had heard. Buck said he had heard that Dale had a visitor. Dale asked him where he had heard it. Buck did not answer that. Buck said that whatever Dale had going on out here was Dale's business until it became everybody's business. And then it was going to become everybody's business fast. And he was here as a courtesy to give Dale a chance to make it his own business first. Dale said Buck was talking in a lot of circles for a man who had driven 20 minutes to say something. Buck laughed the way he did. He said if there was a big cat on Dale's ground, the smart thing was to put an end to it before it moved on down the valley and got into somebody else's calves. He said he would be glad to bring his dogs over. He said he would be glad to bring them tonight, if that suited Dale, and there would not need to be any paperwork about it, and by morning nobody would need to have any conversation with the biologists or the sheriff or anybody. Dale kept his face very still. He said he did not know what Buck was talking about. Buck let the silence sit for a long moment. Then he said, "Well?" He said, "Well, all right." He picked his hat back up off the hood. He said he hoped Dale knew what he was doing. He said sometimes a fellow's sentiment gets in the way of a fellow's judgment, and when that happened, it was neighbors who ended up paying. He got in the truck, and he drove off. Marcus watched him go, with his hands in his back pockets, and did not say a word. Dale looked over at Marcus and asked him, low and level, whether he had said anything in town. Marcus said no. He said it fast, and he said it without looking at Dale. Dale looked at him a moment longer, and Marcus finally raised his eyes and shook his head and said, "No, boss." He had not said anything, and Dale nodded and said, "All right," and they went back to the pen and finished worming the calves, and neither of them mentioned it again that day. But Buck knew. Somehow Buck knew, and nobody had been on Dale's property except Dale and Pam and Marcus. That night, Dale drove into town. He parked in front of the little cafe on the highway, and he sat in his truck for 10 minutes, deciding whether to go in. Then he went in. Pam was already at the corner booth she liked because it faced the door. She had asked him to meet her. She had a folded piece of paper in front of her on the table, and she slid it across when he sat down. It was a photograph, printed from a computer, black and white and grainy, but clear enough. It showed a Jaguar walking on a game trail at night, the flash of a trail camera catching her eyes as two round white circles. Underneath, someone had written in blue pen the words, "Caught on my east boundary Sunday night," and the initials B.H. Buck had sent it. He had sent it to a group text that Pam's son was on because Pam's son leased pasture from Buck for his outfitting horses. Pam's son had shown Pam. Pam had brought it to Dale. Dale looked at the picture for a long time. He said quietly that it wasn't the same cat. Pam asked him how he knew. Dale said the spots on this one were different, that the rosettes on the shoulder ran a different pattern than the mother he had watched drink from his trough, and that this one looked bigger. Pam looked at him a little differently. She said, "All right then." She said she believed him. She said maybe it was a male, maybe another one had come up from Sonora, maybe two had come up. She said it was going to get worse before it got better, and they needed to make a phone call whether Dale wanted to or not. Dale slept on it. In the morning, he made the call. The biologist's name was Adrienne Baker. She was maybe 40, small and sun-lined, and she drove up from Tucson at first light the next day in a battered green Forest Service truck. She sat in Dale's kitchen and drank his coffee and listened to him talk without moving her face at all, except that her eyes got slowly and steadily bigger as he told the story. When he got to the part about the cub emerging from the barn, she put down her coffee cup and asked him to say that part again. He said it again. She asked him to describe the mother. He did. She asked him to describe the cub. He did. She asked him how old he thought it was. He said maybe 8 weeks. She asked him if he was sure. He said he was as sure as a man who had never seen a Jaguar cub before could be. She sat back in his kitchen chair and put a hand over her mouth and did not say anything for probably a full minute. Then she said quietly that if what he was telling her was true, then everything the scientific community had said about jaguars in the United States for the last 100 years was wrong. Dale asked her to explain that. She explained. She said the last documented breeding jaguar in the United States had been shot in Arizona in 1963. Every jaguar sighted in the country since then had been a lone male, a wanderer, an outrider from the breeding populations down in Sonora that never went home. There had never been a female. There had certainly never been a cub. If a female jaguar had denned and given birth in southern Arizona in this year right now, then the entire idea of what jaguars could and could not do in this country was rewritten. It meant the species was moving north. It meant the borderlands might yet, someday, hold a real breeding population again. It was, she said, the biggest wildlife story of her generation, and she was sitting in his kitchen. Dale asked her what she needed him to do. Adrienne said, first, that she needed him to not tell anybody. He said quietly that it might be too late for that. He told her about Buck. She closed her eyes for a moment. She said, "All right." She said, "That changes things." She said they needed to move fast. She spent the day walking Dale's property with him. She took photographs of the barn floor, of the small hollow scooped by the cub, of the pacing tracks around the empty pail. She took photographs of the paw prints in the mud around the trough. She measured them. She took hair samples from the doorframe where the mother had rubbed against the wood the day she stepped aside to let Dale open the latch. She showed Dale, without any drama at all, that in the northwest corner of the barn there was a scuffed patch of dirt beside a warped board, and that under the warped board there was a hollow just barely wide enough for a very small animal to slip through, and that there were faint marks along the inside of the board where a cub's claws had scrabbled trying to widen it. Dale stared at the board a long time. He said quietly that he had not seen that on Tuesday. Adrian said gently that he probably had not looked for it. She said cubs that small could fit through almost nothing, and that was likely how the cub had gotten in the first place. She said sometimes a mother stashed a cub in a hidden spot she thought was safe while she went to hunt, and the cub wandered and got itself into somewhere it could not get itself out of. She said it happened. But she also said something else. She crouched down and pointed to a series of scrape marks in the dirt just outside the warped board. And she said those scrapes were made from the outside going in, not from the inside going out. She said the cub had not squeezed under that board and gotten trapped. Something bigger, with fingers, had loosened that board and had put the cub through it. Dale sat down on an overturned bucket and put his hands over his face. Adrienne did not say anything else. She let him sit. He thought about the trough. He thought about the way the Jaguar had walked past his cattle without looking at them. He thought about her sitting so patient at the barn door, waiting for a man she had never met to come and undo what a man had done, because that was the only door the cub had ever gone through, and she knew it. He thought about how a woman had once walked past his kitchen and looked at him through the glass. He thought about who would take a Jaguar cub away from its mother and put it in a locked barn on his property. He thought about Marcus. He did not want to think about Marcus. Marcus had eaten Christmas dinner at Dale's table twice. Marcus had held the ladder for him when he cleaned the gutters last October. Marcus had been the one to help him bury his old dog when the dog finally gave out in April. He did not want to think about Marcus, but Marcus was the one who had known about the bobcat that Dale had thought was in the barn. Marcus was the one who had suggested to Dale on Tuesday evening that maybe he should go over and take a look before dark. Marcus was the one who had been standing right beside him when Buck came up the drive, and Marcus had not been able to meet Dale's eyes. Dale looked up at Adrian. He said quietly that he thought he knew. Pam came over that night. So did Adrian, who had checked into the little motel by the highway and driven back out with a laptop and a notebook. The three of them sat at Dale's kitchen table with the curtains drawn and did not turn on the porch light. Dale told them, slowly and carefully, everything he could remember about the Tuesday when he had shut the barn. He remembered that Marcus had come with him partway across the pasture, then turned back to the truck, saying he needed to grab something. Marcus had rejoined him at the barn door. Dale had gone in alone with the flashlight. He had come out and shut the door and slid the latch. He had thought Marcus was standing behind him the whole time. He was no longer sure. Pam asked Dale whether Marcus had any connection to Buck. Dale said no, not that he knew of. Adrian asked whether there was anyone else Marcus might have been connected to. Dale thought about it a long time. He said that Marcus had spent a few weeks a year in Douglas visiting family, and that some of that family, Dale had heard once and never asked about, had been in some kind of trouble with what people down there politely called the business. Adrian did not have to ask what business. There was only one kind of business people down at the border called the business without saying its name, and it was not the ranching business. She said carefully that there was an international trade in exotic cats. She said cubs were sold to private collectors. She said a female Jaguar cub with documented Arizona origin, if such a thing could be even partially proven, would fetch a price so extraordinary that she did not want to say the number out loud in a kitchen. She said she had been to seizures where cubs had been recovered from garages and from bedrooms and from the trunks of cars. She said she had never seen a case where someone had used a wild-born cub to try to bait its mother, but she had heard rumors. There were people, she said, who paid very well for a Jaguar hide, or a Jaguar skull, or a set of Jaguar claws. It was illegal. It had been illegal for decades. That had never stopped anyone. Pam looked at Dale and asked him what he wanted to do. Dale looked at Pam and asked her what she thought he could do. Pam said very quietly that they could either go to Fish and Wildlife tonight and hand it all off, or they could wait a day and try to find out for certain what was happening before it fell into hands they could not control. Dale said he wanted a day. They gave him a day. He barely slept again. In the small hours of the morning, he heard a truck pull up the gravel road at the far end of his property. It was not close enough to the house to see. He got up and stood at the kitchen window and watched. Headlights swept once across the tops of the cottonwoods along the wash and then went dark. He stood at the window for over an hour. He never saw the truck come back out. He did not go out to look. He was, for the first time on his own land in his life, afraid. In the morning, Marcus came in for coffee like any other morning. He was quiet, but Marcus was always quiet. Dale poured him a mug and set it down and asked him, without looking at him, whether Marcus had been out on the property the night before. Marcus said no. He said he'd gone to bed early. Dale nodded and did not say anything else. Marcus drank the coffee and went out to start on the day's work. Dale stood at the sink and watched him walk across the yard and thought about what he could not yet prove. That afternoon, Adrian called. Her voice sounded strange. She said she had gotten a call from a colleague at the Arizona Department of Game and Fish. Someone had tried to sell a Jaguar cub that morning to a broker in Phoenix who worked with the exotic pet trade and who happened, unbeknownst to the seller, to also occasionally cooperate with law enforcement. The broker had strung the seller along and pumped him for details. The seller had said the cub had come out of Sonoita. He had said he had it in a garage south of town. He had said he could get more. Adrian said the broker had recorded the call. She said the voice on the recording was not Marcus's. She played it for Dale over the phone. It was Buck Hollister's voice. Dale had to sit down. He sat down right where he was, in the middle of his living room floor, and he held the phone in his hand and did not say anything for a long time. Adrian said gently that Buck had almost certainly not done any of the physical work himself. Buck had almost certainly paid someone. She said whoever Buck had paid had gotten the cub out and turned around, most likely, and put it in Dale's barn as a place to hide it while things got arranged, or as a mistake, or, she said, and this was the part she did not want to say, as a lure, because a mother jaguar looking for her cub would come. And a mother jaguar coming out onto open ground was a jaguar you could shoot. Dale said very quietly that this was a lot of trouble to go to. Adrian said money made people do a lot of trouble. Dale asked her what they were going to do. Adrian said Game and Fish was already moving. Federal agents from Fish and Wildlife were driving down from Phoenix. There was going to be a raid on the garage. There was going to be, if things went the way they were supposed to, an arrest. But she said something else. She said all of that would happen tomorrow at the earliest. And Buck, she said, was smart enough to know that the moment a broker heard those words, the clock had started. Buck was going to move fast. He was going to try to make the cub disappear before anyone could prove it had ever been in his hands. And if the cub disappeared, so did the case. Dale asked her where the cub was right now. Adrian said she did not know for certain, but she said the garage was a small outbuilding on a piece of property Buck's cousin owned, out on the county road 3 miles east of Sonoita. She said the broker had gotten enough detail to be pretty sure. Dale stood up. He hung up the phone, and he walked to his gun safe, and he stood in front of it for a very long time. Then he called Pam. Pam picked up on the second ring. Dale told her, in 6 sentences, what had just happened. Pam did not ask questions. Pam said she was on her way. Pam said she was bringing her son. Pam's son was a large, calm man named Ray, who had been in the Marines before he had come home to run horses, and Ray had a way of showing up in trouble and making the trouble much smaller just by standing in it. They were at Dale's house within 20 minutes. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Pam laid out the county road on a paper map with a pencil. She marked where Buck's cousin's place was. She marked the road in and the road out. Ray asked what the plan was. Dale said he did not have a plan. Ray said that was probably a good place to start, because plans made in a hurry got people killed. Ray asked Dale what he was actually trying to accomplish. Dale said he was trying to make sure the cub did not get moved before fish and wildlife could get down here. Ray said, all right. He said he could do that. He said they did not need to take anything from anyone. They just needed to sit on the property line and watch. If a vehicle came up to that outbuilding, they would call the sheriff, and the sheriff, whatever his other faults, would come to a call from Ray. He asked Dale if he was up for that. Dale said he was. They went in Ray's truck. Dale sat in the back seat with his old 30-30 across his lap and did not chamber around because Ray had asked him please not to. Pam rode up front with a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars in her lap. They drove out the county road with their lights on low. They pulled off onto a track that ran along a little rise about a quarter-mile from the cousins' fence line, and they killed the engine. And they sat. They sat for 2 hours. The sun went down. The stars came up. It was a bright night, no moon, but enough starlight to see the outline of the small outbuilding down below and the 2-track road that led up to it. Coyotes howled off to the north. Something rustled in the mesquite behind the truck. Ray did not so much as move. At just past 10, they saw the headlights come up the road from the south. A pickup. It turned onto the 2-track and drove up to the outbuilding. 2 men got out. They did not turn on flashlights. They knew where they were going. One of them was tall and thick-shouldered, and the way he moved even at that distance was unmistakable. Buck. The other was smaller and moved with the quick shrug of a man who did not want to be there. That, Dale thought without wanting to, was Marcus. The 2 of them went into the outbuilding. Ray keyed his phone. He called the sheriff. He spoke quietly and clearly for perhaps 40 seconds. He hung up. They waited. The 2 men were inside the outbuilding for maybe 6 or 7 minutes. Then they came out. Buck was carrying something in his arms, wrapped in a horse blanket. The something was moving weakly. Dale, without meaning to, made a sound in his throat. Ray said quietly that they were going to sit tight and that the sheriff would be there in 10 minutes. Buck and Marcus put the wrapped bundle in the bed of the pickup. Marcus climbed in behind it, hunched over it, holding it steady. Buck got in the driver's seat. The pickup rolled slowly back down the 2-track toward the county road. Dale said quietly that they could not lose them. Ray started the engine. They followed at a careful distance with the lights off. The pickup turned south on the county road. It drove for maybe 2 miles, past the last of the ranch houses, out into the country where the road ran straight between fenced pasture on one side and a long stretch of state land on the other. Then, without signaling, the pickup pulled off onto the shoulder and stopped. Ray killed his engine and coasted to a halt beside a stand of oak that hid the truck from the road. Ahead of them, Buck got out of the pickup and walked around to the tailgate. Marcus climbed down from the bed with the wrapped bundle in his arms. The 2 of them talked. Dale could not hear what they were saying, but Marcus's shoulders were up around his ears and his hands were tight on the bundle, and Buck was pointing off into the state land with his whole arm. Marcus shook his head. Buck said something sharper. Marcus turned to walk away, and Buck grabbed his arm. There was a struggle. The bundle almost fell. Marcus twisted free and stepped back. He held the bundle against his chest with both arms, and he shook his head over and over. He was saying no. Buck reached into the pickup and came back out with a rifle. Ray was out of the truck and moving before Dale had time to think. Pam had a hand on Dale's arm, holding him back, because Ray had said not to move and Ray meant it, and Dale had trouble breathing. And out on the road, Buck raised the rifle and Ray shouted from the shoulder. Ray shouted the way a man shouts who has been trained to make his voice a physical thing. He shouted Buck's name once, sharp and hard, and Buck spun toward him with the rifle in his hands. For a second, everything on that piece of road held its breath. Then two sets of headlights came around the bend behind them, bright and white and undeniably official. The county sheriff's car, and behind it a second unmarked vehicle that Dale would later learn had been Adrienne herself. And behind that, further back but coming fast, three more vehicles in a small train. Buck lowered the rifle. He did not put it down. He simply held it at his side. Marcus took one long step backward, clutching the bundle. Then Marcus turned and ran, straight into the state land, straight into the mesquite, running with the bundle clutched to his chest, like a child running from a burning building. Buck yelled something after him. Buck did not chase him. Buck did the thing that men like Buck always do at the last moment, which was set the rifle down carefully on the tailgate of the pickup and put his hands on his hips and turn his face very calm. The sheriff was out of his cruiser before it had come to a full stop. His hand was on his sidearm, but he had not drawn it. He asked Buck, in a voice as tired as a man on the far side of a long night, what in God's name Buck thought he was doing out here at 10:30 at night with a rifle. Buck said he was hunting coyotes. The sheriff looked at him for a long moment and did not answer. Ray was already moving down toward the fence line into the state land, in the direction Marcus had run. Dale, without asking Pam's permission, was out of the truck and moving after him. The state land here was open mesquite scrub, broken by rocky washes and stands of yucca, and running through it at night with only starlight to see by was a foolish thing. Dale caught his foot on a root twice in the first 100 yards. Ray moved through it like it was noon. They found Marcus after perhaps 4 minutes, kneeling in the bottom of a shallow wash, holding the bundle against his chest and rocking back and forth. He looked up as they came down the bank, and his face was wet. He said, before either of them spoke, that he had not known. He said it in a rush. He said Buck had come to him 3 weeks ago with a proposition. Buck had said there was a Jaguar somewhere in the country south of Sonoita, and that Buck knew a way to bring it out. Buck had said all he needed was somebody with access to a place the cub could be held safely for a day or two until Buck could arrange the sale. He had said no harm would come to it. He had said the buyer was going to keep it as a pet in a good facility and would pay a lot of money, and Marcus's cut would be enough to get his mother out of the trailer she was living in Douglas and into a real house. Marcus had said no. He had said no 3 times. Then he had said yes. He had gone out that night, the night before the Tuesday when Dale had gone to check the barn, and he had helped Buck's man take the cub from where it had been stashed by its mother in a rocky den up in the state land, and they had brought it down, and Marcus had loosened a board on the equipment barn and put it inside. He had not thought the mother would come. He had thought the mother had abandoned it, that Buck had picked a moment when she was hunting somewhere far away. He had not thought about the mother coming to Dale's ground and sitting at the barn door. He had not thought about the cub going 3 days without water because Dale had latched the door and made the hole too small for the mother to find. He had not thought about any of it. He had thought about his mother's trailer. And then when the Jaguar had come, and Dale had opened the barn, and the cub had walked out and been reunited with its mother in front of him, Marcus had understood what he had done. He had watched Dale that morning, and he had wanted to throw himself into the dirt and beg. He had not. He had gone back to work. He had told Buck it was over. Buck had laughed at him. Buck had said the mother would come back for water. Buck had been right. The night before this one, the night Dale had heard the truck out at the far end of the property, Buck's man had come back onto Dale's ground with a spotlight and a rifle. He had lain in wait at the wash. He had planned to shoot the mother when she came down for a drink, but the mother had not come down. She had stayed high on the ridge. She had known. She had somehow known. And Buck's man had gone home empty-handed. And so tonight, Buck had done what he had said Marcus was going to help him do all along, which was get the cub out of Dale's country and into a truck bound south. And Marcus, sitting in the bottom of that wash, holding the bundle against his chest, said he was not going to let that happen. He said he was going to take the cub back. He said he was going to try to find the mother's den. He said if Ray and Dale wanted to help him, they could, and if they wanted to take the cub in and turn him in himself, they could do that too. Ray very gently knelt down beside Marcus. He asked Marcus if he could see the cub. Marcus nodded. He peeled back the horse blanket. The cub was small and thin, and it was breathing, but only just. Its eyes were closed. Ray put 2 fingers on the cub's rib cage and held them there and said quietly that the cub needed a vet, and it needed one now. They walked back to the road. Marcus walked between Ray and Dale with the cub cradled against him. The sheriff had put Buck in handcuffs by the time they got back. Buck was sitting on the tailgate of the pickup with his hands behind his back, and he looked, for the first time in Dale Sutton's memory, like an ordinary tired old man. Adrienne was already on the phone with the wildlife veterinarian in Tucson. The unmarked vehicles turned out to be 2 federal officers and a state officer, and they took the cub gently from Marcus's arms and put him in a padded crate they had brought and lifted him into a vehicle. The vehicle drove away. Marcus stood on the shoulder of the road and cried the way Dale had cried in his kitchen. Nobody said anything to him for a while. Then the sheriff walked over and said Marcus was going to need to come in with them and give a statement. Marcus said he knew. He said he understood. He put his hands out in front of him. The sheriff did not cuff him. The sheriff said, "Just come along, son," and Marcus walked to the cruiser and got in the back seat. Adrienne came over to Dale. She said the cub was in bad shape. She said it was dehydrated and stressed and had a low fever, but she said the vet in Tucson was one of the best in the country with wild cats, and the cub had a real chance. She said the plan, if the cub pulled through, was to try to return it to the wild. There was a good chance the mother would still be somewhere close. Jaguars did not give up on their cubs easily. And this mother, she said, had shown that better than any jaguar in memory. Dale asked what was going to happen to Buck. Adrienne said Buck was looking at federal charges for trafficking in an endangered species, and probably several state charges besides. She said men like Buck did not usually spend a lot of time in prison, because men like Buck had lawyers and money, but that his cattle operation was going to see everything it had ever done audited from the ground up, and by the time the paperwork was over, he might well be finished as a rancher. She said sometimes that was justice enough. Dale said what was going to happen to Marcus. Adrienne looked at him a long moment. She said Marcus was going to be a witness, and a good one, because Marcus was going to tell the truth. She said the prosecutors might well work with him. She said what happened after that would be up to him and the sheriff and the judge, but that people who cooperated fully in cases like this usually did not go to prison. Dale nodded. He got in the truck with Pam and Ray, and they drove home. Nobody spoke on the way. When they got to Dale's house, Pam got out and hugged him without saying anything and got in her own truck and drove to town to sit with Marcus. Ray shook Dale's hand and left. Dale stood in his yard alone. The stars were extraordinarily bright. He walked out to the equipment barn. He unlatched the door and pulled it open and let it stand open all night. He filled the trough. He walked back to the house, and this time he slept. The cub lived. He got word 2 days later, from Adrienne herself, that the little one had rallied. He was drinking. He was standing. His fever had broken. The vet in Tucson was cautiously optimistic. It was going to be a long haul, but the cub was going to make it. The next question was what to do with him. The default in a case like this would have been to place the cub in a captive facility for the rest of its life. That was what happened to cubs who could not be released. But this cub had a mother, a living mother. A mother who had walked 5 miles out of her way across working ranch land to sit at a barn door and wait for a stranger to let her baby out. If they could find that mother, the vet said, and if the cub was strong enough to travel, they might try something no one had ever tried in the United States before. They might try to bring the cub back to the den and give the mother her cub. There was no guarantee, of course, Mothers of any species could reject a cub that had been in human hands too long. The cub had been away for many days by the time he would be ready. The mother might be gone. She might have given up. She might have moved on. But she might not have. 2 weeks later, Adrian called Dale on a Tuesday morning and told him they were going to try. She asked if he would come. He said yes. They met at the head of the wash, where the mother had always come down onto Dale's land at the very first light of morning. It was a small group. Adrian, 2 of the state wildlife people, the vet from Tucson, Pam, and Dale. The cub was in a padded crate. He was bigger than Dale remembered. He was almost twice the weight he had been the day he had stumbled out of the barn. He was looking at the world with clear yellow eyes now, the blue baby cloudiness gone. They walked up the wash for maybe 2 miles. Adrian had spent the last 10 days with a team scouting, and they had found what they believed was the mother's den in a jumble of granite boulders on state land above a spring. There had been fresh scat. There had been tracks. There had been one evening a glimpse of a spotted body slipping between 2 rocks. She was still there. She was waiting. They stopped 100 yards below the den. Adrian took the crate. Everyone else, except the vet, moved back another 100 yards and lay down behind a low rise. Adrian walked the crate up to a flat spot on a ledge below the boulders, set it on the ground, opened the door and walked away. They watched from the rise. The cub came out of the crate slowly. He looked around. He was in a place that smelled, perhaps, like a memory. He took a few unsteady steps. He sat down. He mewed. It was a small, high sound that carried farther in the still morning air than seemed possible. Nothing happened for a very long time. Dale lay on his belly with his face pressed against his forearm and did not know if he could bear to watch. He forced himself to. The sun climbed. The shadows shortened. The cub mewed again. Nothing. And then, from between 2 great boulders above the ledge, a spotted head appeared. She stepped out slowly. She was thinner than Dale remembered. She stood on the ledge above her cub, and she stared at him for a long moment. She did not run down. She waited. She read the air. Then she came down the ledge and stopped a few feet from him, and she lowered her head and pressed her nose to his ears, and to his flank, and to his belly. And Dale, lying on his stomach on a rocky rise 100 yards away, heard through the still air that same low rumbling sound she had made in his yard when she had waited for him to open the barn door. She picked her cub up by the loose skin behind his neck. She turned. She carried him up between the boulders and into the shadow, and they were gone. Nobody at the rise made a sound. Adrian was crying. Pam was crying. Dale did not know he was crying until he tried to wipe his face on his sleeve. They walked out of the wash slowly and did not speak much. At the trucks, Adrian turned to Dale. She told him what would happen next. She said the whole area, several thousand acres of it, was going to be moved into a special protection status by the state and the federal government working together. She said the news of what had happened here was going to change conservation policy in the country. She said scientists were already writing papers about the return of breeding jaguars to the United States. She said none of it would have happened if Dale had picked up a rifle instead of opening a door. Dale did not know how to answer that. He said what he said to anything he did not know how to answer. He said, well. He drove home. Buck Hollister was arraigned in federal court that fall. He took a plea in the end because his lawyers found him a plea. He avoided prison, but he lost his outfitter's license, and the wildlife trafficking case brought a wave of scrutiny onto his ranching operation that eventually turned up years of federal grazing lease violations that Buck had been sitting on. His grazing leases were cancelled. Without them, his operation could not carry his herd. He was forced to sell most of his cattle. He was, within 18 months, out of the ranching business entirely. He moved to a smaller place outside of Nogales and did not come around Sonoita much anymore. Dale saw him once at a hardware store in Elgin 2 years later. Buck did not meet his eyes. Dale did not press it. There's a kind of ending that is quieter than a courtroom, and men who once carried the whole valley in their pockets learn what it means to be nobody in a hardware store. That was Buck's sentence. It was enough. Marcus took the plea agreement the prosecutors offered him. He gave testimony that helped seal the case against Buck. He was sentenced to community service and probation. He also lost his job with Dale, of course. Dale did not fire him. Marcus quit. He said he could not look Dale in the face every morning, and he was probably right. He moved back to Douglas and got work at a body shop. His mother, in the end, got her house, though not by any means Marcus had originally hoped. A settlement fund set up by the wildlife protection groups involved in the case paid a small amount to witnesses whose testimony had been essential, and Marcus turned every dollar of it over to his mother the day it hit his account. He called Dale once, 6 months after he left. He said he was sober. He said he was going to church. He said he did not expect to be forgiven. Dale said, quietly, that forgiveness was not a thing anyone gave you, that it was a thing you built for yourself over years by doing the next right thing over and over, and that as far as Dale was concerned, Marcus had made a start. They did not speak again after that call, but Dale thought about him often, and he hoped for him. Adrienne came out to Dale's ranch every few months. She brought pictures. There were trail cameras up all through the new protected zone now, and one by one those cameras began to catch her. The mother, sometimes alone, sometimes with her cub, growing steadily, spot patterns deepening. By the time the cub was 1.5 years old, he was almost as big as she was, and Adrienne said the vet was almost sure it was going to grow into a young male. That meant someday that this male would go looking for a female of his own. Adrienne said they had already begun documenting other jaguars in the borderlands, drawn perhaps by his mother's presence. She said in her lifetime, and maybe in Dale's, there could be a breeding population back in Arizona. She said, and this was the part that made Dale set his coffee down and look out the window, that a lot of people were going to be very grateful to Dale someday for what he had done. Dale said he had not done anything. He said he had opened a door. He said anybody would have done that. Adrienne, very quietly, said that a lot of people would not have. The Jaguar herself came back to Dale's land maybe 6 times over the following years. Never to the yard, never near the trough, never near the barn again. Always at a distance, always at the tree line, always visible for maybe a minute and then gone. He was never sure if she came to check on him or if she was passing through and simply liked to look. Pam said she thought the Jaguar remembered him. Dale did not know how to think about a Jaguar remembering him, but he liked to think it too. Pam and Dale started having supper together on Tuesdays. It began as a practical arrangement because Pam was tired of cooking for herself, and so was Dale, and it turned into something else that they were both slow to name and eventually did not need to. When Dale's daughter, born to his late wife and long grown, came out from Colorado to visit the ranch 2 years after the Jaguar had first walked across it, she watched her father and Pam moving around each other in the kitchen for one evening, and then turned to her father and said quietly that her mother would be glad. Dale had thought so too. It was a comfort. Dale kept ranching. He was getting older, and it was harder every year. He hired a new hand. He replaced the tractor. He fixed the roof on the equipment barn, but he never latched the door again. He simply left it open. He put a low wooden feeder inside it for the barn cats and a shallow water dish. Sometimes in the winter he found the scat of a bobcat in the corner. He did not mind. The trough beside the barn he kept full, always. In the summer he ran a slow drip of well water into it so it would not go stagnant. He would sometimes stand at the kitchen window on a still morning and look out across the pasture, past the fat white Herefords grazing peacefully in the sun, out to the barn and the trough and the tree line beyond, and he would think without meaning to about the way a spotted body had once walked that fence line without touching it and made a sound at his door that was not a growl and not a warning. He would think about how a mother had stepped one long, careful stride to the side to let a strange man in blue jeans come to the latch. He would think about how sometimes the things that show up on your doorstep are not what you think they are, and how the thing you fear the most in this life might be the very thing that has come to teach you something you did not know you needed to learn. On what would have been his 41st anniversary, Dale walked out to the equipment barn at first light with a cup of coffee in his hand. He stood at the open door and he looked inside at the swept dirt floor where an animal had once paced in circles for 3 days. He looked at the trough, full and shining. He looked at the tree line beyond, quiet in the pink light. Something small moved in the mesquite. A rabbit, maybe. A mule deer at the wash. He watched a long moment. Nothing more. He turned back to the house. Pam was on the porch with a paper bag of pan dulce and a smile that was quieter than most smiles, but reached further. The sun was barely up. If you made it all the way to the end of this story with me, do me a favor and hit that like button so more people can find it. Drop a comment telling me the part that moved you most. And go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss what's next.